Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the breeding biology of birds. There's, I'd say, quite a bit to this particular lecture. When's my PowerPoint doing this? What are you doing, PowerPoint? There we go. So this chapter goes into discussion of things like timing of breeding, territoriality, nest sites, nest structures, uh, information about the egg, and a little bit about the developing bird. The bird after it hatches, it's a very broad chapter, but all relates back to breeding. I'm going to cover a good bit of the chapter in this lecture, but not all of it because it's a very excuse me, a very long chapter. So let's start out with timing of breeding. So in general, timing is tied to resource availability. And so if we think about the difference of resource availability between something like a temperate breeder versus a tropical breeder, this might make a lot of sense. You think of temperate breeders, well, when are temperate breeders going to breed? They're going to breed when their resource availability is very high because they're going to be feeding those resources to their young. So they need an optimal density of resources to make sure that their young survive. Uh, and so an example of a temperate breeder would be something like a blue-winged warbler, uh, which you see on the bottom left there. That's going to feed its young insects. Um, on the other hand, if you look at tropical breeders have resource availability actually over a very large window of time. And so when they time their breeding seasons out quite a bit differently, they time their breeding seasons out more in alignment with rainfall. So in drier seasons, a lot of tropical birds um, have their breeding season to coincide with drier seasons. Some coincide with transitional seasons as you transition from dry into rainfall, and then some breed year round in the tropics. But in general, timing is tied to resource availability. In many birds, particularly in passerines, insects are a super important food source for those young. So the timing with high density of insects is a really big deal. It is true, though, that for species, particularly we're talking temperate species here, species that don't feed on insects or don't use insects as their primary food source for their young, they may have very different timings for when they breed. An example of this is an American goldfinch that you see in the bottom middle there. American goldfinches actually time their foraging much later in the season. Instead of spring, they don't really breed until like midsummer. And the reason for that is that they mostly eat thistle seed. That's a really important food source for them. And thistle seed is going to come on in late summer. And so, in all cases, these birds' breeding season begins usually like a couple weeks before their food sources peak. That way, they can reproduce, they can lay, and they can have hatched young hatching at about the time the food availability peaks. Eleanor's falcon is another example. This is a Mediterranean bird. And its hunting season is much later. It's a fall hunter. I shouldn't say a fall hunter. That's a silly statement. A fall breeder. It's a fall breeder. Um, and so it really the season starts at the end of summer and then into early fall. And there's a reason for that. The premium time for food availability in this bird is during migration because this bird's picking off passerines migrating through. And so when passerines are moving around, it's very, very easy. They're abundant. There's tons of them flying around the region as they migrate in this. It's like a giant buffet for this bird. So that makes it easier for them to supply their young with food. Another interesting example related to timing of reproduction is the red crossbill, or crossbills of the northern hemisphere in general. These guys eat pine and spruce seeds, and pine and spruce seeds have a lot of variety in when they actually, well, pine and spruce have a lot of variety in when they put on seed. And it varies from place to place. And so, what a lot of crossbills will do is they maintain their reproductive systems so that whenever there's an abundance of food in a location, they can take advantage of that and reproduce at that time. Essentially, they're sort of ready to breed whenever conditions merit it throughout the year. Now, this is interesting because if you remember from learning about the reproductive system, the urogenital system, you probably remember that, as an example, the testes shrink outside of breeding season, right? This doesn't happen in these birds because they have to be ready to reproduce whenever the resources are available and wherever they're available. So unlike a lot of other birds where they essentially jettison a lot of the reproductive anatomy, don't fully jettison it sort of atrophies, right? That reproductive anatomy shrinks. They don't do that. All right, breeding territories. Um, Defending a territory is a very costly activity, right? It takes time, it takes a lot of energy, and also is relatively risky. You are exposed to predators while you're out advertising your territory. But of course, the trade off is that you can attract mates to that territory. And then mate attraction is a function of the size and quality of the territory. And things that make territory particularly enticing, one of the biggest things is food abundance. Is there enough food in this territory that I, as the, in this case, it would be like the female selector of a male mate, can raise all my young successfully? Has he defended a strong enough territory to do that? The territory also comes, of course, or defending territory also comes with the benefit of repelling competitors of the same species for a mate. And I know we talked about this in a previous chapter, but when you advertise a territory, you're kind of telling other competitors of the same gender, hey, I'm here, I'm defending this territory. Don't try to come in here and reproduce with one of my females. And of course, we know that gender roles can reverse in this situation in some birds as well. So some examples that are relevant to this discussion: purple-throated caribs of the Lesser Antilles, like you see here on the left. They will, the females will choose males that have the highest quantity of nectar in their defended territory. That's how one of the qualities they look for in the male. And when it comes to repelling competitors, if you look at something like green-rumped parrotlets, these guys are found in like Colombia and the Guyanas, in that area. These birds stay on high alert basically all the time to defend their nests, to repel competitors. In this case, they're nest competitors, where individuals will fly over to adjacent nests and destroy eggs. And so they defend that territory very aggressively. And in trials where mock nests were put out with fake eggs in them, and then you play calls like there's a territory, birds would come in and destroy those eggs pretty readily. And in those false nests, it was something like 40% of undefended eggs were destroyed. When nests are defended, it's only about 5% of the time that you have loss of eggs. So these breeding territories are very important for both of these reasons. Nest site selection. So how does a bird select where to put a nest? There are a few different qualities that are very important in this. First, the nest should be inconspicuous, or if not inconspicuous, very difficult for a predator to actually get to. Second, they should provide adequate protection to the young from the environment and from the young falling out of the nest. Third, they should be in close proximity to food and any other resources that are needed. And finally, they should be placed away from brood parasites. So let's talk about some of those things. So first here, we've got a slaty-tailed trogon on the left. They do a really interesting thing, and I think there's a picture of this in your book. They build their nests in termite mounds. So they literally, they're arboreal termites, so the termite nest is up in a tree. But they build their nests in these termite nests, and the termites don't bother them, which is very interesting, and no one really knows why. Presumably the termites get something out of this relationship themselves, or there's some sort of chemical trickery going on. We don't need to get into insect ecology right now to go into that level of detail, but basically the termites don't bother the slaty-tailed trogons. The slaty-tailed trogons get to nest inside of the termite nest, and if any other predator comes around that termite nest, the termites are going to attack that predator, and so it's a repellent, right? Like predators don't want to deal with all the termites and everything that comes with that. The same is true there's lots of birds, particularly tropical birds, that'll build their nest near wasp nests, for example. And so if a predator's up there and it disturbs the wasp nest, it's going to get attacked by the wasps, and that's a massive deterrent for a number of predators, and so the birds benefit from that. If you we looked at earlier in a different lecture, the Montezuma or a Pendola, and we talked about the sort of breeding hierarchy in those birds. If you look at their nests are really interesting. They build their nests way out on the ends of thin branches, and they're these long sack-like nests, and that's what you see in that picture in the middle here. Well, by building their nests out at the end of long branches, it's really difficult for most predators that aren't flying predators to get to those nests, just in general. Even if you're like a snake, if you're a hefty snake on the end of one of those super thin branches, like the branch is just going to bend, possibly break, you're going to die. It's just not really something that you can easily get to. So that's part of that strategy. But then also note that it's like a sack. One of the things about that sack-like structure is that eggs really can't fall out of that nest, right? They are very well kept within that nest. Crab plovers, that's what you see here on the right, they build their nests in sand burrows. They build their nests close to other resources that they need. What do they need? Well, they need crabs. They need to hunt tidal flats for crabs, like you see in this picture. So they build their nests in sand burrows that are very close to the tidal flats. And then finally, when we talk about brood parasites, a big thing with brood parasites, so what a brood parasite is, and a brown-headed cowbird is really, if you're in my region, it's like the premier nest parasite that you'd have to worry about. So what the brown-headed cowbird does is it lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, and those birds will raise those young. And so they don't really select a nest site for themselves. They select a host nest to lay their eggs in. What's very interesting about that is how it affects their host birds. If you play calls in a region of the brown-headed cowbird, you play its call. The host birds, if they hear that call, are much less likely to put a nest in that area. They will instead move away and put their nest maybe nearby, but away from that particular brown-headed cowbird. And this is generally going to be true for various nest parasites. And this makes sense because you don't want to get stuck in a situation where you have to raise the young of another species. There's a lot of interesting things with the relationship between the cowbirds um, and other and their hosts. For example, sometimes if it's like so a yellow warbler would be an example of a host of brown-headed cowbird. Sometimes they will raise those frequently. They'll raise those birds fully to adulthood, and you'll see like a brown-headed cowbird with a little tiny warbler beside of it, and it's teaching the brown-headed cowbird how to fly and everything else, just like it would with its own natural young. If a brown-headed cowbird figures out that a yellow warbler or some host has rejected that egg, it will go down, sometimes killing the eggs or young that are already on the nest and laying another egg in that same nest. So in many cases, once those eggs are laid, the the host bird will just deal with it. And in some situations, it's thought that the host bird just doesn't have any idea that's not its own young. There's a lot going on with the brown-headed cowbird host relationship that is extremely interesting. Okay, so your discussion, and I just put this here because this is where it fell in the chapter relative to this narrative. So the next part of the book goes into nests and nest types and nest structure and all, how often do nests get reused, and do birds ever take nests from other birds, things like that. So your discussion this week is to choose a species that hasn't been discussed in the book in Researchers Nesting Biology. Describe, I have all these things here, you can read it, it'll be posted. Describe all these things about the nest, as many of them as you can find. Some of them you're not going to be able to. And then discuss how these aspects of the nest are reflected in the natural history of the species. So here's an example, like some birds that nest on cliffs will have very pointy eggs, very, very pointy shaped eggs. Why are their eggs so much pointier than, say, a chicken egg? There is some logical reason for that to be the case. So that's something that you might look at. Your response is very typical of all the other responses. Compare your species nest and the surrounding natural history to your classmate's species. All right, let's take a look at eggs now. So this diagram goes over the this is like I would call them basic structure of an egg. Obviously, you have a shell on the outside of the egg. That shell serves to retain moisture. That's a very important function. And for protection, it also serves as a gas exchange interface. So even though it's a hard, calcite-based shell, it actually has little holes in it that allow gas exchange to occur. They allow gaseous waste to actually leave, and they allow oxygen to enter. And that's a very important part of the function of the shell. And this picture on the right here, is showing a cross section of an actual shell, and you can see here you can see really well this pore space. Here's another pore right here coming through. You see these pore spaces in the shell. Here you have a diagrammatic representation of what that looks like. That's the gas exchange interface. Other things you have an air cell on the broader end of the shell. That air cell is basically a gap between the cell membranes. That is a pocket of air, and that I'll take a look at it in a minute, but it actually gets bigger over time throughout the developmental cycle of the bird. Then you have an outer and inner membrane. The outer and inner membrane are fused together into this thing called chorion allantois, or the chorion allantoic membrane. The chorion is the membrane that is used for gas exchange through the pores, and it's full of blood capillaries. And so uh, if you look at an egg as the young is developing at a certain point, you'll see that where once that was just this sort of clear, thin, flimsy membrane, it becomes loaded with capillaries. And that's because those capillaries are responsible for picking up the oxygen through those pore spaces and nourishing the developing bird. The allantois is sort of the membrane that's going to hold in waste products produced by the bird, because of course the baby bird developing inside the egg is producing waste, just like any creature undergoing metabolic processes produces wastes, and those wastes have to be held somewhere. So like they're like urate crystals that get produced, and then some of the waste is of course gaseous in nature, and it leaves ultimately through the pore spaces as well. But some of it is solid. It can't be gotten rid of while the baby is inside the egg, while the embryo is inside the egg, and that's held inside of the allantois. The vitelline membrane, this is just a membrane that surrounds the yolk itself. The yolk, of course, is this highly nutrient-rich substance that is loaded with fats, proteins, a little bit of carbohydrates as well, and also vitamins and minerals. So it is the major source of nutrition for the developing embryo. Around that is the albumin. The albumin is what you think of when you think of egg whites. It's the part that when you cook it is white, which is essentially mostly water and some protein. It's like 90%, I think, water. The chelaza are these two white proteinaceous structures that extend from either end of the yolk to either end of the egg. These act like a spring or like an elasticy kind of band that suspends the yolk in such a way that it's not bumping off either side of the egg. If this thing gets rattled, the yolk is sort of on this spring-like structure, the chelaza, that it just kind of gently jiggles back and forth on that chelaza. And those are the major structures of the egg. So most birds lay one egg per day. That is a typical laying schedule for birds. And in general, with very rare exception, do not lay ever more than one egg per day. There's a couple weird, funky examples where that's not quite true, but generally it's true. That being said, the yolk takes more than a day to develop. So if you want to lay an egg every day, you actually have to get all your yolks ready prior to laying. And that stage is called the yolking up stage. It's where the bird prepares the yolks for the entire clutch. And a clutch, we're going to talk about in a minute, but it's just all the eggs that are going to be laid in a single laying event over some number of days. So all the yolks are prepared ahead of time. And this whole process can take, a week or 2 weeks. It can take quite a while. This is the yolking up stage, is building up the yolk. If you look at a yolk with the appropriate lights after it's been developed, you will see that the yolk has rings. Those rings correspond to day and night cycle. In the daytime, when the female is consuming pigment-rich foods, the yolk will be loaded with a ring of pigments. In the nighttime, as the female's not feeding, the yolk that gets produced is lighter in color. And so you get rings that are much like the rings of a tree that tell you how many days it took to produce the entire yolk. It's just kind of just a neat thing in general. Now you see on this picture this white mark on the surface, this very light mark on the surface. That is the germinal disc or germinal spot. It is where the female genetic material is stored. So it's where fertilization, the fusion of gametes is going to happen, and ultimately the embryo is going to develop from that spot. Um, yeah, so that's the yolk. I said that the membrane sort of changes a little bit as time goes on, and this is what this is doing is depicting that. So this is early on. Sorry, this is early on with the membrane within 8 days of fertilization, and you have 14 days. And what you can see is what happens is the membrane sort of, it almost looks like it's collapsing around the young. That's not really what's happening. What's happening is as the young develops over time, uh, evaporation takes place, and a lot of the moisture content of the egg is lost, right, as through the pore space as time progresses. And what happens is the air cell gets bigger and bigger and bigger throughout that time. Interestingly, that air cell, when the baby bird begins to hatch, this air cell is going to be the first breath of air that the baby bird is going to take before it gets and works its way out of the egg. All right, so let's talk about clutches. Here we have extreme examples of clutches. So a clutch in general is just an uninterrupted series of eggs that is laid during a nesting period. So like if it's 1 egg per day and the bird's laying 5 eggs, it's those 5 eggs, and then it's done. It's so that's the uninterrupted series. And clutch size is tremendously variable in different species. There are lots of birds that lay like 1 egg. This is a magnificent frigate bird there on the bottom. That's nest on the bottom as well. Lays 1 egg. So its clutch size is 1. Up on the top there we have a gray partridge. Gray partridges lay really big clutches. The number is variable. I think in this picture it's 18 or 19 eggs in a clutch, and that's a big clutch. It's one of the larger clutches that any bird really produces. There are some funky examples of really big clutches. So ostriches, actually common ostrich, have huge clutches of like 50. But they have this thing of a communal nesting where multiple females will lay in a single nest. So those, if it's a 20 eggs or 30 eggs or 40 eggs or whatever it is, it's not one female's clutch. It's several females laying in a single nest. So that's quite different. But that's what a clutch is. The size of the clutch is dependent on several different factors. The first, and what is, I would say, the most obvious, is food availability. If food is scarce, females lay less eggs because they know they can't, there's no way they're going to support that many young, so they just lay less eggs. Also, there's the fact that it takes a lot of resources to produce the eggs and produce the yolk. And if they have less food, they are physically less capable of producing those things. The cost becomes too high. Feeding behavior is another thing that affects clutch size. So if you are a species that has to feed your young after they are born, you're going to have less babies than a species that doesn't have to deal with that. So because that's less mouths to feed. So for example, any species where the young are born self-sufficient, and we'll take a look at what that really looks like in a minute, where they can fairly quickly get up, walk around, and forage themselves, they're going to lay more eggs in total. The geography. In general, birds in the tropics lay smaller clutches than birds at higher latitudes. And this is counterintuitive because when you think about food availability and everything, you think, oh, the tropics, well, they're going to have more food. There's a funky thing in the tropics with temperature, though. Temperature is higher in the tropics, right? And so when a bird lays an egg, even if it's not ready to incubate that egg, the ambient temperature can be so warm that it starts to incubate that egg just through ambient temperature. That is a problem because that egg, once it starts to develop, is now sort of reliant on, at least until the bird's ready to actually sit on her eggs, is reliant on ambient temperature for development. And birds that don't have young birds in the egg, developing birds that don't have like intentional uh, brooding happening, where the female's sitting on the eggs, they have a less, they have a lower chance of survival, right? So basically, in the tropics where temperatures are warm, that that ambient temperature triggering sort of premature incubation can cause a survivorship problem where those young actually die. So the trade-off to this then is to lay smaller clutches, so there's a less window of time where that is a problem. The type of nest actually has an effect as well. Cavity nesters tend to have larger clutches than open nesters. This actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. If you're an open nester, so an open nester is just not in a cavity, not in an enclosed space, but if your nest is out and it's somewhat exposed, um, the young in those nests, when they hatch, they're going to be peeping and moving around, however much they do that. Some of them don't move all that much, but they will be making noise and moving a little. They're exposed, and because they're making noise, because they're moving, they're much more prone to predation than individuals in a cavity. In a cavity, not, predators can't see those individuals, and most likely they're not going to hear them either. So those individuals are generally safer from predation. So you can have more of them without catching a predator's attention because they're almost like they're behind closed doors. Whereas if you're out in the open, you're much more noticeable, and when you're moving around and making noise, a predator's going to lock on pretty quick. So if you lower your clutch size in the open, you have less of a chance of that becoming a problem. Season. Season is another one. So uh, in general, if you are a species that lays more than one clutch a year, so you have some species will lay like 2 or 3 clutches a year. It's the middle of the season that tends to get the largest clutch, and then the early and late season clutches tend to be smaller. If you're a single clutch species, clutch size in general is largest for species that lay early in the season. And the age of the female actually matters. Um, so young females tend to lay smaller clutches even when laying at the exact same time as old females. They tend to lay small clutches. So those are some of the things that affect clutch size. It's a quite a list. All right, clutch and egg replacement. So what happens if a clutch is lost? Well, first, if a clutch is lost, most, I don't know if most is actually accurate. A lot of different species will replace the clutch. Um, Contrary to that, if once the young are hatched, if they are lost, most species will not clutch again that season, meaning they're not going to lay another clutch, um, unless they're a multi-clutch species. So then you have the situation, well, what if it's just an egg? Like, what if the clutch was going to be 5 eggs, but something came in and took 1 egg? Well, there are 2 different possibilities. There are determinate layers, that is, species that lay exact set number of eggs, and they don't really change from that. They don't deviate from it. If that's the case, they will, once they've laid their 5 eggs, if one of them gets taken, like, they don't change. They just keep on rolling with what they got. Indeterminate layers, though, will replace eggs until the clutch reaches a specific size. That being said, once incubation begins, the female stops laying. So there's only, a relatively small window where this is relevant. I was trying to think of So there's an example with northern flickers, and I think this, I'm almost sure this was in your book. It's a really interesting example. Some species, indeterminate species, are capable of laying way more eggs than what they would actually produce in a clutch. And an example of this is this northern flicker experiment that was done. So you have an average clutch size for them is something like 6 or 8 eggs. But uh, experimentally, it was possible to coerce the northern flicker to continue to lay eggs basically every single day by just taking one egg out of the nest over and over and over again. And what happened was is that the flicker was capable of laying 71 eggs over 73 days, which means it had the potential to lay that many eggs. It just chose not to lay that many eggs, um, which is kind of amazing to think. But obviously, the flicker wouldn't want to try to take care of 70 young. You know, they have a sort of, I can take care of 6 babies, I can't take care of 70 babies, and so they go for what they can actually take care of. Incubation. So incubation are just the behaviors. It's a behavioral thing um, that parents use to keep their eggs in an optimal temperature range so that the embryos develop um, in the best way possible. And that temperature is between 37 and 38 degrees Celsius. This primarily happens through the use of body heat. A bird physically lays on the eggs and transfers body heat to the eggs. But that is not always the case. We'll take a look at the sort of traditional situation here in a minute. Let's look at some weird examples. So first we have the mallee fowl from Australia. And this is a megapode. All the megapodes do weird stuff like this. Um, these guys build this big mound. You can see the mallee fowl on their mound here, and you see it looks like a sarlacc pit. It's got this big like I don't hole in it here. The eggs get laid down here, and what they do is the male gathers organic matter, and that organic matter it starts breaking down, right? As it breaks down, it generates heat. And so what the male has to do is throughout the period at which the eggs are being incubated, the male has to constantly either add to or take away material, organic material, from the decaying pile around the egg so that the surrounding environment stays at the appropriate temperature for their development. It's a really cool incubation system. Brown-headed cowbirds, of course, as we talked about earlier, they don't incubate anything at all. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and those birds incubate their eggs. And then here on the right, we have an example that is totally the opposite of what you might think of when you think of incubation. This is a Wilson's plover, and Wilson's plover is in a situation where these are found on the Gulf Coast in regions that are extremely hot. And they actually have to cool their eggs down to maintain an optimum temperature. And to do that, they wade out into the water and they dip their chest down in the water. They get their feathers moist, and then they come back over and they lay on top of their eggs and get the water on their eggs to cool them off. Here we can see this is related to the traditional manner in which birds incubate, where they use their physical body heat to do so. On the left, there is looks like a hairy woodpecker, and you have a researcher, probably a looks like field biologist of some sort, blowing on the belly. That's why the feathers are all spread out there. They're blowing down on the belly, probably with a straw. I have to do this when I do my field research. And what they're exposing is this huge patch of just empty skin, and beneath the skin is this layer of clear lipid, and then you get vascularization of that tissue, and that's called the brood patch. So this big barren space is a brood patch. Feathers actually fall out of this, and at the end of the season, these will fill back in. This whole thing shrivels up. The vascularization goes away. The lipids go away. It just becomes this dry, crusty region, and then feathers grow back in at the end of the breeding season. But that is what makes physical contact with the eggs, that brood patch. They literally are physically laying that in contact with the eggs to transfer heat from their bodies to their eggs. Some birds, so like I think this is a herring gull in this picture, or some kind of gull. Rather than have one big brood patch like in that woodpecker you see there, they'll have several small brood patches. It works the same. It's just a little bit of it's a unique take on the brood patch. Some birds like this is a Magellanic penguin on the right. Their brood patch is sort of more of like it's almost pouch like. It's like a big flap that wraps around the whole egg. But it does the same exact thing. I should say, in some birds, and in a number of different species of birds, in fact, males also incubate. So in those species, you'll see a brood patch on males and females, and woodpeckers are an example of that. If you're a field ornithologist like I am, you use these brood patches during the breeding season to sex birds. It's one of the helpful characteristics in sexing birds. You cannot, if you say catch a couple different hairy woodpeckers, you can't use the brood patch though, because the males should have one as well. So you use other characters, and luckily for woodpeckers, there's very easy plumage characteristics that will help you do that. You can also use what's the cloacal protuberance, because only the males will have a cloacal protuberance. But the big point here being that males sometimes will have a brood patch as well, and will also sit on eggs. In terms of duration, we have what's called the incubation period. This is just the number of days from the time incubations started to when the birds hatch. And it's highly variable from as little as 11 days to as many as 80 days. It varies tremendously by species, and it doesn't vary in a way that's intuitive. Birds that you would think must be able to develop their young very quick, like some hummingbirds, actually take longer than some birds that are much, much larger. So it's not super intuitive. Within a given species, in a given area, you can have interruptions in the incubation period, which will cause pauses, essentially giving some individuals within that population a quicker incubation time than other individuals in the same population. And so that could be an issue where within this population, across this given environment, some individuals have a better time, maybe because of where they are nesting, and they have more food resources, and so they don't need to slow the incubation and interrupt that incubation to go hunt for additional food. That could be an example of what would cause that. An interesting thing is sometimes clutches fail, and I have a good example of this. I track, along with a friend of mine, northern saw-whet owl nests in the mountains here in West Virginia. We have a bunch of nest boxes out, and every year we go and we look at their nests and record a bunch of data on their nests. It is entirely possible to have a bird lay a saw-whet owl lay eggs and none of them hatch. Sometimes through for a variety of reasons, including like genetic defects in the young. Eggs just don't succeed. They're defective clutches. And we've had that happen before. We So what we have to do is we go out and we climb these ladders up to get to the nests. We count the number of eggs, and we leave, and then we wait for a set period of time. The, the time period depends a little bit on a number of factors. But we wait a set period of time, and then we go back so that we can actually band the young birds about right before they should fledge or leave the nest. That is generally how we do it. But we have gone and literally marked the eggs, come back, usually it's a couple weeks later, and the eggs have never hatched. So those are defective clutches. When there's a defective clutch, some birds, their signal to stop incubating is babies hatching. Like, oh, babies are hatching, I'm good to go. I'm done. When that doesn't happen, they don't really know, like, do I need to incubate a little bit longer? I'm not sure what to do. And so they will incubate sometimes up to 3 times the normal incubation period in an attempt to hatch their young before they will give up on those eggs and abandon that nest. All right, when do they start incubation? So it might be intuitive to go if I lay the first egg and then I start incubating, but that is not always the case. In fact, that is usually not the case. Uh, Incubation usually starts when the last egg or the penultimate, the next to last egg, is laid, not when the first egg is laid. Laying, incubating, beginning with the first egg has some important implications. It creates, for one, it ties the adult to the nest longer, right? If you're going to lay, say, 5 eggs in a clutch, and you start incubation from egg 1, that's 5 more days that you have to be on the nest incubating. So that's a problem. It also creates asynchronous hatching, and asynchronous hatching is not necessarily a problem. And in fact, in some manner of thinking, it is a benefit. But what it does is because the first egg that was laid on the first day has been incubating before the second, third, fourth, fifth egg, it will hatch a day earlier, right? It started earlier, so it hatches earlier, which means each individual in the nest is 1 day older than the next. Uh, this has an important implication for the survivorship of the young in the nest. If you're the first egg that hatched, all other things being equal in the individuals, you will develop quicker. You'll develop quicker, which means you will be a little bit stronger than the other individuals and a little bit more, how do I say that? Good at baking. You'll have more, because you're physically larger, you'll be able to beg with a stronger emphasis. And so the young, they literally beg for food from the mother. The mother, if the mother's the one feeding the young, will have to assess in a given clutch which young are the most likely to survive if resources are limited. And the ones that beg the best are the ones that get resources. So that means that if you're the last egg in a resource limited situation and all other things are equal, like genetics and things like that, that you will be the one to not be fed. You will starve. And if resources are very limited, it might be the last couple eggs, last couple babies to hatch that starve. This is called brood reduction. It's essentially the the feeding parent refusing to feed what it perceives to be the least likely individuals to survive. So that is asynchronous hatching and brood reduction. Within the incubation period, there are attentive and inattentive periods, meaning times when incubation is happening and times when the adult has to go off the nest. And this varies greatly. The duration varies greatly. But birds do tend to leave their nest usually in about the middle of the day for a certain period of time to go do some foraging. It by species this is extremely different, but just in general. Something like an emperor penguin. The male emperor penguin stays and incubates the egg for as long as 64 days, and that is a full attentive period. It doesn't leave. And the way that the male emperor penguin has to survive is through body fat stores. He has to have enough body fat stored up that he can sit on that egg, keep it warm, and provide energy to himself to survive. So that's like one extreme end. Sort of the other extreme end is this is a Caruprinia, that bird in the middle. It kind of looks like a thrasher mockingbird, freaking weird thing. Um, that's a Caruprinia. It's a really cool bird, but they do something very very different. They are off the nest for more than half of the day. So they are inattentive for as long as they are attentive. Um, Something that can really drive length of inattentive period is if a resource is limited that the parent needs. So in birds like blood pheasants, they need mosses, these mosses that they eat, and the mosses are hard to find. And so the blood pheasant will go on long forays searching for these mosses, and that can take up to 6 hours. So they'll be gone for 6 hours a day, typically in the morning, looking for these mosses. That's attentive and inattentive periods in a nutshell. Basically, many birds leave at some point in the day. They leave the nest, and there's an inattentive period for sitting on the clutch. Behavior. Okay, so there are a number of behaviors associated with incubation. The first is, aside from obviously sitting quietly on eggs, which is the main primary behavior you might think of when you think of incubation, there is egg turning, where in many birds the female will um, either incidentally move eggs around as she moves around, or will intentionally roll eggs, like just turn them a little bit. She'll use her beak and move them. This is called egg turning. Egg turning is in some ways kind of mysterious, but it's interesting. So there are birds that don't turn their eggs, and everything turns out perfectly fine. I have to say that up front. And that's why I say it's a little bit mysterious. But there are some reasons to think that egg turning is beneficial, and that's why birds do it. For one, it prevents the membrane that the chorion allantois from adhering to the bird. If the bird is constantly laying the embryo, okay, is laying constantly against that membrane in the same position, the membrane can actually get stuck to its body. And that's not good. So it helps prevent that. It also, as you turn the egg, the nutrients in the yolk get kind of gently mixed, and it's thought that it could help with the distribution of the nutrients within the yolk and create a nice even distribution of those nutrients to create a good solid symmetrical growth of the individual. And there are some other hypotheses for the purposes of egg turning that go along with all of this. Ultimately, though, it's a little bit mysterious because, like I said, there are a few birds that don't turn their eggs, and everything turns out fine. So, some other behaviors. Some birds get super aggressive during this period of time. They will attack you. Even birds that are otherwise really, really nice birds, like emu. A male emu can become very, very defensive during incubation time, and like he might be the cuddliest emu in the world, but not during incubation time. Don't mess with him. Another example of this is the Canada geese. Canada geese get quite aggressive. Some owls get quite aggressive, and those are times where you you have to account for that change in behavior that comes with that, particularly if you work with that animal in a captive setting and they're incubating. A bird that you might feel very comfortable with and that usually you get along with very well literally might come at you, try to get you, because they are hormonally, neurologically wired to defend that nest against anybody coming around. So that's important to know. Some birds have a really cool behavior where they're cryptic. So in other words, they blend in really well with their surroundings because of their coloration and patterning. And during incubation, will really heavily rely on that crypsis. Um, and the American woodcock is an example of this, where it is uh, very hard. I mean, if you just try to like go out and look in like a wet field for woodcock, they're so hard to see. They give themselves away with their sounds, but visibly, if they're just sitting there, they're almost invisible. To get them to actually move off their nest during incubation, you have to physically touch them. Like you can crawl right up to them, and they won't move until you're right on top of them. And they're just really hoping that you don't see them. That's the whole thing. There's also some interesting behavior surrounding trying to avoid having to sit or incubate the young between sexes. So an example of that is the Eurasian pendulum tit. This is a Eurasian pendulum tit nest on the right. This is from your book. The Eurasian pendulum tit, the female, as she's laying, will hide all the eggs she's laying. And the idea here is this. If she lays a couple eggs, the male, if he sees that, he's going to know she's laying and I can leave, and she's going to have to incubate these young. So what she tries to do is literally at the bottom of the nest, she tucks the eggs and then covers them up, and she tries to wait until she's got them laid and then leave so that he comes back and finds the eggs and he's the one that has to incubate them. It's quite the tricky behavior. All right. Ultimately, after the incubation period is over, the eggs hatch. They will hatch into either what are altricial chicks or precocial chicks. What you see here on the left is an altricial chick. Altricial chicks are just basically they still have a lot of development to do before they're functional birds. They have very few. They have natal down, like you can see on this bird. They have a little bit of natal down, but they generally have very few feathers. Their eyes aren't developed. Their um, metabolic processes aren't fully up to speed, so they can't maintain their own body temperature. And when you have an altricial chick, the uh, parent bird still has to stay with that individual and keep it warm. With precocial chicks, like on the right, that is a spotted sandpiper baby, within a very short window of time, sometimes it's hours, sometimes it might be a couple days, these babies are ready to get up and move around and they can forage by themselves. Essentially, they have spent more time developing in the egg, or they have developed to a further point, I guess, within the egg, so that when they hatch, they're pretty well ready to go. And these require, of course, less parental investment in terms of literally, physically keeping those young warm, brooding them. So that's early development. Your book goes into a bit more like detail on this section, and so of course you need to read your book. There's some other things to cover there, but I knew this was going to be at about an hour, if not a little. I thought it might even go a little bit over. It didn't. It went right to an hour, but I wanted to try to keep it around an hour, so you'll have to read that part yourself. But yeah, that's the breeding behavior. This is one of the more, to me at least, fascinating aspects of avian biology. There are so many different strategies that birds utilize and approaches to these things, and it's really cool. Um, if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to me.